Welcome to my story time by mybooksummary.com. Get ready for quick wisdom of countless stories and explore. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was one of those conflicts that seemed to have all the ingredients for something truly dramatic. Two countries divided by an ideological line, the involvement of global superpowers, a struggle for dominance, and countless lives affected. Yet, despite its intensity, the Korean War is often one of the lesser-discussed wars of the 20th century. Maybe it's because it's sandwiched between World War II and the Vietnam War, two conflicts with more immediate cultural impacts on the West. But the Korean War was a pivotal moment in the early Cold War years, and its effects can still be felt today. Introduction: a war that nobody wants to remember. At its core, the Korean War wasn't just about Korea. It was a global struggle, a conflict between ideologies, communism versus democracy, that marked the deepening divisions of the Cold War. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, launched an invasion of the South. In response, the United Nations, with the United States at the helm, quickly intervened on behalf of the South. The war, which lasted for 3 bloody years, involved some of the fiercest fighting of the Cold War, with millions of soldiers, civilians, and families caught in the crossfire. It was a tragic, brutal conflict, one where victory was elusive and peace remained just out of reach. As with most wars, the Korean War started for a number of reasons, but the big picture is that it was a battle of ideologies. North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, was driven by the belief in communism as a system that could unify Korea under the banner of a single leader. Meanwhile, South Korea, under President Syngman Rhee, wanted to maintain a capitalist, democratic state free from the influence of communism. The United States and the Soviet Union, both superpowers at the time, provided the two opposing factions with military support. The Soviets supported the North, while the Americans supported the South, and this external involvement turned a regional conflict into a larger Cold War battleground. The road to war, a world divided. Before the Korean War erupted, Korea had already been divided along the 38th parallel, essentially a line that split the peninsula in two. Following Japan's defeat in World War II, Korea, which had been under Japanese rule since 1910, was liberated. The peninsula was divided into two occupation zones, the Soviet-backed North and the US-backed South. What was supposed to be a temporary solution became a permanent, physical divide, with both sides struggling to form their own governments. In the North, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as the leader. He was an ardent communist who had the backing of Joseph Stalin, and he pushed for a unified Korea under communist rule. To the south, the United States supported Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist who was seen as a bulwark against communist expansion. For 3 years, both sides tried to set up their own governments, with the North's communist regime growing more aggressive in its ambitions to reunify the peninsula. While tensions were building, neither side was prepared for a full-scale war. But then, on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, heavily armed with Soviet equipment, launched a surprise invasion of the South. Their goal was simple: take Seoul, the capital, and quickly conquer the South. The North's well-equipped military pushed through the South, and within days, they were within a striking distance of the capital. The United Nations steps in, a Cold War fight for ideological dominance. In the days following the North's invasion, the United States and its allies rushed to respond. The United Nations, with the US as its most powerful member, quickly condemned the attack and called for intervention. The UN Security Council passed a resolution that effectively authorized military action, with the United States taking the lead. The rationale was simple. If North Korea succeeded in taking the South, it would be a major win for communism in Asia, tipping the balance of the Cold War. U.S. forces quickly landed in South Korea, and President Harry S. Truman gave the order to send troops into the conflict. However, the South was in serious danger. Within a few weeks, North Korean forces had captured almost all of the South, except for a small pocket in the southeastern corner, known as the Pusan Perimeter. With the threat of communist expansion growing, the U.S. was determined to stop the spread of communism in Asia, and it would not allow North Korea to succeed. The early days of the war were grim for the South. The North's military was much better equipped, better trained, and more organized. But then came the dramatic turning point. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been appointed as the commander of UN forces in the Korean peninsula, masterminded a daring amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city on the western coast of Korea. The operation, launched in September 1950, was a resounding success. The UN forces recaptured Seoul and forced the North Korean army into retreat. The Chinese intervention, a war with no clear winners. At this point, the war might have ended with a decisive victory for the US and the South, but that's when China decided to step in. The Chinese, led by Mao Zedong, were staunch communists and saw the American military push northward as a threat to Chinese security. They didn't want to see a pro-Western Korea on their doorstep, so in October 1950, Chinese forces entered the war on the side of the North. The Chinese intervention completely changed the dynamics of the war. The UN forces, which had been making significant progress in the North, were suddenly confronted by a massive new enemy, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. The Chinese forces, though less technologically advanced, were numerous and determined. They launched a series of offensives, forcing UN troops to retreat southward. What followed was a long, drawn-out stalemate. The front lines shifted back and forth along the 38th parallel, with no clear winner. The war turned into a brutal test of attrition, with both sides suffering immense casualties. The fighting was fierce, and the battles were often fought in extreme cold and mountainous terrain. By 1951, the war had become a war of positions, where neither side could make significant advances. The negotiations and armistice, a truce but no victory. By 1951, both sides had realized that victory would not come easily. While the fighting continued, both the UN forces and the North Koreans began to engage in peace talks. However, these talks were complicated by the ongoing conflict, as neither side was willing to make significant concessions. The North Korean regime was unwilling to give up its goal of reunifying Korea under communism, while the UN forces, led by the United States, were unwilling to let go of South Korea's sovereignty. The stalemate persisted for 2 more years, and it wasn't until 1953 that a ceasefire agreement was finally reached. On July 27, 1953, the Korean War officially came to an end with the signing of an armistice agreement. However, this was not a peace treaty. The two Koreas were divided at the 38th parallel, with a demilitarized zone, DMZ, running between them. The armistice left Korea divided, but it did not formally end the war. The fighting stopped, but the peace talks remained unresolved. The aftermath, a divided nation. The Korean War left deep scars on both North and South Korea. The fighting had caused widespread destruction, especially in the North. Millions of people had died, and countless families had been torn apart. The war also left the peninsula divided, with no peace treaty ever signed. The two Koreas would go on to develop very different political systems and economies. North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, would become a brutal, isolated dictatorship, while South Korea, with US support, would eventually evolve into a democratic and prosperous nation. The Korean War had far-reaching consequences, too. It was one of the key events in the early Cold War and marked the first major armed conflict between the Western Bloc and the Communist Bloc. The US policy of containment, which sought to prevent the spread of communism, was put to the test in Korea. The war also had lasting effects on American foreign policy, leading to increased military spending and further military involvement in Asia, including the Vietnam War. Final thoughts: a war that shaped the modern world. The Korean War may not be as talked about as World War II or Vietnam, but its impact on global politics cannot be overstated. It was a conflict that defined the early years of the Cold War and set the stage for decades of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. While the war did not end in a clear victory for either side, it solidified the division of Korea and set the stage for the geopolitics of the region for decades to come. Today, North and South Korea remain separate nations, with tensions still running high between them. The Korean War is a reminder of the human cost of ideological conflicts and the dangers of war. It was a war that no one really won, but it was a war that shaped the world we live in today. Whether you view it as a necessary evil, a tragic mistake, or a fight for survival, the Korean War remains a pivotal chapter in the history of the 20th century, and its lessons are still relevant today. Stay tuned for more enlightening content. Head over to www.mybooksummary.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share the magic with friends, and let's grow together through the power of books and interesting stories.